What's up, YouTube family? This is Elder Stacy Zanders coming to you with another video. Today, you may have heard that the Supreme Court voted 6-3, taking away affirmative action when it comes to college admissions. Those that grew up in a black or grew up in the black community, you understand probably those even in our generation understand how difficult that it is when it comes to dealing with race relations in the United States of America. And it touches us in a certain way. I know I've told my children before, I said, so sometimes some of the feelings that I have about the white race, not everybody, but it's the communities, what I have experienced when we were younger, I said it comes from a real place. The trauma is there. We lived in a town in Knoxville, Tennessee, and the community we lived in was actually Christianberry Heights. And I would tell my children, I remember the white kids on the school bus coming home, spitting in our faces, chasing us home when we got off the school buses. You know, the N-word was a consistent and constant thing that was thrown around. And this was in the 50s. This wasn't the 60s. This was in the late 70s that this stuff took place. But these are real experiences. And throughout life, being discriminated against from employers and things of that nature is some of the things that push me to go work for myself and not have to deal with that type of behavior. But I am going to read the dissent from Ketanji Brown Jackson. Many of us don't read these type of documents or letters to educate ourselves. It should be a part of everybody's summer reading program, just to read this dissent that she wrote. It's a very impassionate dissent. Ketanji Brown starts by saying that it is a tragedy for us all, and for us all that's in America that this is taking place and happened. And but let me begin reading her dissent. Please pay attention and listen to it. She goes down throughout the history of discrimination, and I know many people want to just move past it, but we can't move past it when it's still alive and well. When President Trump became president of the United States, it reinvigorated. A company that I was working with at that particular time, it reinvigorated people's discriminatory ideas, ideologies, philosophies, and their proclivities to share those things with those of us that work at the company. And but this dissent is very telling. It's telling where we're going to go as as a people and as Americans. And there is something that we should be able to do about it. That's why it's important for us to participate in these elections and things of that nature, so that we can help curtail or bring an end to this disparity. All right. Let me begin reading her dissent. Golf-sized race-based gaps exist with respect to the health, wealth, and well-being of American citizens. They were created in the distant past, but have indisputably been passed down to the present day through the generations. Every moment these gaps persist is a moment in which this great country falls short of actualizing one of its foundational principles, the self-evident truth that all of us are created equal. Yet today, the court determines that holistic admissions programs like the one that the University of North Carolina, UNC, has operated, consistent with Grutter versus Bollinger in 2003, are a problem with respect to achievement of that aspiration rather than a viable solution, as has long been evident to historians, psychologists, and policymakers alike. Justice Sotomayor has pervasively established that nothing in the Constitution or Title VI prohibits institutions from taking race into account to ensure the racial diversity of admits in higher education. I join her opinion without qualification. I write separately to expound upon the universal benefits of considering race in this context, in response to a suggestion that has permeated this legal action from the start. Students for Fair Admissions, SFFA, has maintained both subtly and overtly that it is unfair for a college admissions process to consider race as one factor in a holistic review of its applicants. This contention blinks both history and reality in ways too numerous to count. But the response is simple. Our country has never been colorblind. Even the lengthy history of state-sponsored race-based preferences in America. To say that anyone is now victimized if a college considers whether that legacy of discrimination has unequally advantaged its applicants fails to acknowledge the well-documented intergenerational transmission of inequality that still plagues our citizenry. It is that inequality that admissions programs such as UNC's help to address to the benefit of us all. Because the majority judgment stunts the progress without any bias in law, history, logic, or justice. I dissent. Imagine two college applicants from North Carolina, John and James. Both trace their families' North Carolina roots to the year of UNC's founding in 1789. Both love their state and want their great things for its people. Both want to honor their family's legacy by attending a state flagship educational institution. John, however, would be the seventh generation to graduate from UNC. He is white. James will be the first. He is black. Does the race of these applicants properly play a role in UNC's holistic merits-based admissions process? To answer the question, a page of history is worth a volume of logic. New York Trust Company versus Eisner, 1921. Many chapters of American history appear necessary to give the opinions that my colleagues in the majority have issued in this case. Justice Thurgood Marshall recounted the genesis. 350 years ago, the Negro was dragged to this country in chains to be sold into slavery, uprooted from his homeland, and thrust into bondage for forced labor. The slave was deprived of all legal rights. It was unlawful to teach him to read. He could be sold away from his family and friends at a whim of his master. And killing or maiming him was not a crime. The system of slavery brutalized and dehumanized both master and slave. Regents of University of California versus Blake, 1978. Slavery should have been and was to many self-evidently dissonant with our avowed founding principles. When the time came to resolve the dissonance, 11 states chose slavery. With the Union's survival at stake, Frederick Douglass noted, Black Americans in the South were almost the only reliable friend the nation had. But for their help, the rebels might have succeeded in breaking up the Union. After the war, Senator John Sherman defended the proposed 14th Amendment in a manner that encapsulated our Reconstruction framers' highest sentiments. We are bound by every obligation, by Black Americans' service to the battlefield, by their heroes who are buried in our cause, by their patriotism and the hours that tried our country. We are bound to protect them and all their natural rights. To uphold that promise, the framers repudiated this court's holding in the Dred Scott versus Stanford 1857. By crafting Reconstruction amendments and associated legislation that transformed our Constitution and society. Even after the second founding, when the need to right historical wrongs should have been clear beyond cavil, opponents insisted that vindicating equality in this matter slighted white Americans. So when the Reconstruction Congress passed a bill to secure all citizens the same civil rights as enjoyed by white citizens, 14 Statute .27, President Andrew Johnson vetoed it because it discriminated in favor of the Negro. That attitude and the nation's associated retreat from Reconstruction made prophecy out of Congressman Thaddeus Stevens' fear that those states will all keep up the discrimination and crush to death the hated freedmen. And this court facilitated that retrenchment, not just in Plausi versus Ferguson 1896, but in almost every instance, the court chose to restrict the scope of the second founding. Thus, 13 years pre-Plausi in the civil rights case 1883, our predecessors in this court invalidated Congress' attempt to enforce the Reconstruction Amendments via a Civil Rights Act in 1875, lecturing that there must be some stage when Black Americans take the rank of mere citizens and cease to be the special favorite of the laws. But Justice Harlan knew better. He responded, "What the nation, through Congress, has sought to accomplish in reference to Black people is what had already been done in every state of the Union for the white race, to secure and protect rights belonging to them as freedmen and citizens. Nothing more." Justice Harlan dissented alone, and the betrayal that is court-enabled had concrete effects. Enslaved Black people had built great wealth, but only for enslavers. No surprise then that freedmen leapt at the chance to control their own labor and to build their own financial security. Still, white Southerners often simply refused to sell land to Blacks, even when not selling was economically foolish. To bolster private exclusion, states sometimes passed laws forbidding such sales. The inability to build wealth through the most American of means forced Black people into sharecropping roles, where they somehow always tended to find themselves in debt to the landowner when the growing season closed. With no hope of recourse against an ever-present cooking of the books. Sharecropping is but one example of race-linked obstacles that the law and private parties laid down to hinder the progress and prosperity of Black people. Vagrancy laws criminalized free Black men who failed to work for white landowners. Many states barred freedmen from farming and fishing to ensure that they could not live without entering de facto re-enslavement to sharecroppers. The cornucopia of laws, e.g. banning hiking, prohibiting encouraging a laborer to leave his employer, and penalizing those who promoted Black Southerners to migrate northward, ensured that Black people could not freely seek better lives elsewhere. And when statutes did not ensure compliance, the state sanctioned and private violence did. Thus emerged Jim Crow, a system that was as much as anything else a comprehensive scheme of economic exploitation to replace the Black codes, which themselves had replaced slaveries from of comprehensive economic exploitation. Meanwhile, as Jim Crow ossified, the federal government was giving away land on the western frontier, and with it the opportunity for upward mobility and a more secure future. Over the 1862 Homestead Act three-quarters century tenure, Black people were exceedingly unlikely to be allowed to share in those benefits, which by one calculation may have advantaged approximately 46 million Americans living today. Despite these barriers, Black people persisted. Their so-called Great Migration northward accelerated during and after the First World War. Like clockwork, American citizens responded with racially exclusionary zoning and similar policies. As a result, Black migrants had to pay disproportionately high prices for disproportionately subpar housing. Nor did migration make it more likely for Black people to access home ownership, as banks would not lend to Black people, and in the rare cases banks would fund home loans, exorbitant interest rates were charged, with Black people still locked out of the Homestead Act giveaway. It is no surprise that when the Great Depression arrived, race-based wealth, health, and opportunity gaps were the norm. Federal and state government selective interventions further exacerbated the disparities. Consider, for example, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, created in 1933. HOLC purchased mortgages threatened with foreclosure, and issued new amortized mortgages in their place. Not only did this mean that recipients of those mortgages could gain equity while paying off the loan, successful full payment would make the recipient a homeowner. Obstinately, to identify and avoid the riskiest recipients, the HOLC created color-coded maps of every metropolitan area in the nation. Green meant safe, red meant risky, and regardless of class, every neighborhood with black people earned a red designation. Summarily, consider the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, created in 1934, which insured highly desirable bank mortgages. Eligible for those insured required an FHA appraisal of the property to ensure a low default risk. But nationwide, it was FHA's established policy to provide no guarantees for mortgages to African Americans or to whites who might lease to African Americans, irrespective of credit worthiness. No surprise then that between 1934 and 1968, 98% of FHA loans went to white Americans, with whole cities, ones that had a disproportionately large number of black people due to housing segregation, sometimes being deemed ineligible for FHA intervention on racial grounds. The Veterans Administration operated summarily. One more example of Federal Home Loan Bank Board charter ensured that regulated savings and loan associations from the early years of the New Deal, but it did not oppose the denial of mortgages to African Americans until 1961, and even then opposed discrimination ineffectively. The upshot of all this is that, due to government policy choices in the suburban shaping years between 1930 and 1960, fewer than 1% of all mortgages in the nation were issued to African Americans. Thus, based on their race, black people were locked out of the greatest mass-based opportunity for wealth accumulation in American history. For present purposes, it is significant that, in so excluding black people, government policies affirmatively operated, one could say affirmatively acted, to dole out preferences to those who, if nothing else, were not black. Those past preferences carry forward a rare reinforced today by, among other things, the benefits that flow to homeowners and to the holders of other forms of capital that are hard to obtain unless you already had assets. This discussion of how the existing gap were formed is merely illustrative, not exhaustive. I will pass over Congress' repeated craftiness of family, worker, and retiree protective legislation to channel benefits to white people, whereby excluding black Americans from what was otherwise a revolution in the status of most working Americans. I will also skip how the GI Bill's creation of middle-class America by giving $95 billion to veterans and their families between 1944 and 1971 was deliberately designed to accommodate Jim Crow. So, too, will I bypass how black people were prevented from partaking in the consumer credit market, a market that helped white people who could access it build and protect wealth. Nor will time and space permit me to elaborate how local officials' racially hostility meant that even those benefits that black people could formally obtain were unequally distributed along racial lines. And I could not possibly discuss every way in which, in light of this history, facially race-blind policies still work on race-based harms today. Racially disapparent tax system treatment, the disproportionate location of toxic waste facilities in black communities, or the deliberate action of governments to all levels in designing and interstate highways to beset and segregate black urban communities. The point is this: given our history, the origin of persistent race-linked gaps should be no mystery. It has never been a deficiency of black Americans' desire or ability to. In Frederick Douglass' words, stand on their own legs. Rather, it was always simply what Justice Harlan recognized 140 years ago: the persistent and pernicious denial of what had already been done in every state of the Union for the white race. Civil rights cases. History speaks in some form. It can be heard forever. The race-based gaps that first developed centuries ago are echoes from the past that still exist today. By all accounts, they are still stark. Start with wealth and income. Just 4 years ago, in 2019, black families' median wealth was approximately $24,000. For white families, that number was approximately 8 times as much, about $188,000. These wealth disparities exist at every income and educational level. So, on average, white families with college degrees have over $300,000 more wealth than black families with college degrees. This disparity has also accelerated over time, from a roughly $40,000 gap between white and black household median net worth in 1933 to roughly $135,000 gap in 2019. Median income numbers from 2019 tell the same story: $76,057 for white households, $98,174 for Asian households, $56,113 for Latino households, and $45,438 for black households. These financial gaps are unsurprisingly in light of the link between home ownership and wealth. Today, as was true 50 years ago, black home ownership trails white home ownership by approximately 25 percent points. Moreover, black Americans' home relative to white Americans constitute a greater percentage of household wealth, yet tend to be worth less, are subject to higher effective property taxes, and generally lost more value in the Great Recession. From those markers of social and financial unwellness flows others, and most state flagship higher education institutions and percentage of black undergraduates is lower than the percentage of black high school graduates in that state. Black Americans in their late 20s are about half as likely as their white counterparts to have a college degree. And because lower family incomes and wealth forces students to borrow more, those black students who do graduate college find themselves 4 years out with about $50,000 in student debt, nearly twice as much as their white counterparts. As our post-secondary professional arenas, despite being about 13% of the black population, black people make up only about 5% of lawyers. Such disparity also appears in business realms. Of the roughly 1,800 chief executive officers to have appeared on the well-known Fortune 500 list, fewer than 25 have been black. As of 2022, only 6 are black. Furthermore, as the COVID-19 pandemic raged, black-owned small businesses fell at a dramatically higher rate than white-owned small businesses, partly due to a disproportionate denial of the forgivable loans needed to survive the economic downturn. Health Gaps tracks financial loans. When tested, black children have blood lead levels that are twice the rate of white children. Irreversible contamination, working irremediably harm to developing brains. Black and Latino children with heart conditions are more likely to die than their white counterparts. Race-linked mortality rate disparity has also persisted and is higher among infants. So too for adults. Black men are twice as likely to die from prostate cancer as white men and have lower 5-year cancer survival rates. Uterine cancer has spiked in recent years among all women, but has spiked highest for black women, who die of uterine cancer at nearly twice the rate of any other race or ethnic group. Black mothers are up to 4 times more likely than white mothers to die as a result of childbirth. And COVID killed black Americans at higher rates than white Americans. Across the board, Black Americans experience the highest rates of obesity, hypertension, maternal mortality, infant mortality, stroke, and asthma. These and other disparities that predictable results of opportunity disparities led to at least 50,000 excess deaths a year for Black Americans. Vis-a-vis white Americans. That is 80 million excess years of life lost from just 1999 through 2020. A mimic tells us that race-linked health inequalities pervade nearly index of human health, resulting in an overall reduced life expectancy for racial and ethnic minorities that cannot be explained by genetics. Meanwhile, tying health and wealth together, while she lays dying, the typical Black American pays more for medical care and incurs more medical debt. We return to John and James now, with history in hand. It is hardly John's fault that he is the seventh generation to graduate from UNC. UNC should permit him to honor that legacy. Neither, however, was it James's or his family's fault that he would be the first, and UNC ought to be able to consider why. Most likely, 7 generations ago, when John's family was building its knowledge base and wealth potential in the university's campus, James' family was enslaved and laboring in North Carolina fields. 6 generations ago, the North Carolina Redeemers amid to nullify the civil rights, nullify the results of the Civil War through terror and violence, marauding the hopes of excluding all who looked like James from equal citizenship. 5 generations ago, the North Carolina Red Shirts finished the job. 4 and 3 generations ago, Jim Crow was entrenched in the state of North Carolina that UNC enforced its own Jim Crow regulations. 2 generations ago, North Carolina's governor still rallied against integration for integration's sake. The UNC Black enrollment was minuscule. So at bare minimum, 1 generation ago, James' family was 6 generations behind because of their race, making John's 6 generations ahead. These stories are not every student's story, but they are many student stories. To demand that colleges ignore race in today's admission practices and thus disregard the fact that racial disparities may have mattered for where some applicants find themselves today. It is not only an affront to the dignity of those students for whom race matters, it also condemns our society to never escape the past that explains how and why race matters, to the very concept of who merits admissions, permitting, not requiring colleges like UNC to assess merit fully without blinders on, plainly advances, not thwarts the 14th Amendment's core promise. UNC considers race as one of many factors in order to best assess the entire unique import of John and James's individual lives and inheritances on an equal basis. Doing so involves acknowledging, not ignoring, the 7 generations worth of historical privileges and disadvantages that each of these applicants was born with when his own life's journey started a mere 18 years ago. Recognizing all this, UNC has developed a holistic review process to evaluate applicants for admissions. Students must submit standardized test scores and other conventional information, but applicants are not required to submit demographic information like gender and race. UNC considers whatever information each applicant submits using a non-exhaustive list of 40 criteria grouped into 8 categories: academic, performance, academic program, standardized testing, extracurricular activity, special talent, essay criteria, background, and personal criteria. Drawing on those 40 criteria, a UNC staff member evaluating John and James would consider, with respect to each, his engagement outside the classroom. Persistence of commitment, demonstrated capacity for leadership, contributions to family, school, and community, work history, and his unique or unusual interests. Relevant to would be his relative advantage or disadvantage as indicated by family income level, education history of family members, impact of parents, guardians in the home or formal education environment, experiences of growing up in rural or center city locations, and his status as child or stepchild to Carolina alumni. The list goes on. The process is holistic through and through. So where does race come in? According to UNC's admissions policy document, reviewers may also consider the race or ethnicity of any student if that information is provided in light of UNC's interest in diversity, and is the race of ethnicity of any student may or may not receive a plus in the evaluation process depending on the individual circumstances revealed in the student's application. Stephen Farmer, the head of UNC's Office of Undergraduate Admissions, confirmed at trial under oath that UNC's admissions process operates in this fashion. Thus, to be crystal clear, every student who chooses to disclose his or her race is eligible for such race-linked plus, just as any student who chooses to disclose his or her unusual interests can be credited for what those interests might add to UNC. The record supports the intimidation of the country. Eligibility is just that. A plus is never automatically awarded, never considered in numerical terms, and never automatically results in an offer of admissions. There are no race-based quotas in UNC's holistic review process. In fact, during the admissions cycle, the school prevents anyone who knows the overall racial makeup of an admitted student pool from reading any application. More than that, every applicant is eligible for a diversity-linked plus beyond race more generally. And notably, UNC understands diversity broadly, including socioeconomic status, first-generation college status, political beliefs, religious beliefs, diversity of thoughts, experiences, ideas, and talents. A plus by its nature can certainly matter to an admissions case. But make no mistake, when an applicant chooses to disclose his or her race, UNC treats that aspect of identity on par with other aspects of applicants' identity that affect who they are, just like, say, where one grow up or medically challenges one has faced. And race is considered alongside any other factor that sheds light on what attributes applicants will bring to the campus and whether they are likely to excel once there. A reader of today's majority opinion could be forgiven for misunderstanding how UNC's program really works, or for missing that under UNC's holistic review process, a white student could receive a diversity plus while a black student might not. UNC does not do all this to provide handouts to either John or James. It does this to ascertain who among its tens of thousands of applicants have the capacity to take advantage of the opportunity to attend and contribute to this prestigious institution, and thus merits admission. And UNC has concluded that ferreting this out requires understanding the full person, which means taking seriously not just SAT scores or whether the applicant plays the trumpet, but also to any way in which the applicant race-linked experiences bear on his capacity and merit. And this way, UNC is able to value what it means for James, whose ancestors received no race-based advantages, to make himself competitive for admissions to a flagship school. Nevertheless, moreover, recognizing this aspect of James' story does not preclude UNC from valuing John's legacy as an obstacle that his story reflects. So to repeat, UNC's program permits does not require admission officers to value both John's and James' love for their state, their high school rigor, and whether either has overcome obstacles that are indicative of their persistence of commitment. It permits, but does not require, them to value John's identity as a child of UNC alumni, or perhaps, if things had turned out differently, as a first-generation white student from Appalachia whose family struggled to make ends meet during the Great Recession. And it permits, but does not require, them to value James's race, not in the abstract, but as an element of who he is, no less than his love for his state, his high school courses, and the obstacles he has overcome. Understood properly, then the SFFA caricatures of an unfair race-based preference cashes out, and a holistic system to a personalized assessment of the advantages and disadvantages of every applicant might have received by accident the birth plus all that has happened to them since. It ensures a full counting of everything that bears on the individual's resilience and likelihood, enhancing the UNC campus. It also forecasts his potential for entering the wider world upon graduation and making a meaningful contribution to the larger collective societal goal that the Equal Protection Clause embodies. Its guarantee to the United States of America offers generally equally treatment to everyone, every person, regardless of race. Furthermore, and importantly, that the fact that UNC's holistic process ensures a full accounting makes it far clear that any particular applicant of color will finish ahead of any particularly non-minority applicant. For example, as the district court found, a higher percentage of the most academically excellent in state black candidates, as SFFA's expert defined academic excellence, were denied admissions, and similarly qualified white and Asian American applicants. That, if nothing else, is indicative of a generally holistic process. It is evidence that both the theory and in practice, UNC recognizes that race, like any other aspect of a person, may bear on where both John and James start the admissions relay, but will not fully determine whether either eventually crosses the finish line. The majority seems to think that the race blindness solves the problem of the race-based disadvantages. But the irony is that requiring colleges to ignore the initial race-linked opportunity gap between applicants like John and James will inevitably widen that gap, not narrow it. It will delay the day that every American has an equal opportunity to thrive regardless of race. SFFA summarily asks us to consider how much longer UNC will be able to justify considering race in its admissions process. Whatever the answer to that question was yesterday, today's decision will undoubtedly extend the duration of our country's need for such race consciousness, because the justification for admission programs that account for race is inseparable from the race-linked gaps in health, wealth, and well-being that still exist in our society, the closure of which today's decision will forestall. To be sure, while the gaps of stubborn and pernicious black people and other minorities have generally been doing better, but those improvements have only been made possible because institutions like UNC have been willing to grapple forthrightly with the burdens of history. SFFA's compliant, but the indefinite of the race-conscious admission programs then is a non-sequitur. These programs respond to the deep-rooted objective, measurable problems. Their definite end will be when we succeed together in solving those problems. While there are many perversities of today's judgment, the majority failure to recognize that programs like UNC's carry with them the seeds of their own destruction is surely one of them. The ultimate goal of recognizing James' full story and potentially admitting him to UNC is to give him the necessary tools to contribute to closing the equity gaps discussed in Part 1, Supra, so that he, his progeny, and therefore all Americans can compete without race mattering in the future. That intergenerational project is undeniably a worthy one. In addition, and notably, the end is not fully achieved just because James is admitted. Schools properly care about preventing racial isolation on campus because research shows that it matters for students' ability to learn and succeed while in college if they live and work with at least some other people who look like them and are likely to have similar experiences related to that shared characteristic. Equally criteria, UNC's program ensures that students who don't share the same stories like John and James will interact in class and on campus and will thereby come to understand each other's stories, which a mimic tells us improves cognitive abilities and critical thinking skills, reduces prejudice, and better prepares students for postgraduate life. Beyond campus and diversity that UNC pursues for the betterment of its students and society is not a trendy slogan. It saves lives. It marginalizes communities in North Carolina. It is critically important that UNC and other area institutions produce highly educated professionals of color. Research shows that Black physicians are more likely to accurately assess Black patients' pain and tolerance and treat them accordingly, including, for example, prescribing them appropriate amounts of pain medication. For high-risk Black newborns, having a Black physician more than doubles the likelihood that the baby will live and not die. Studies also confirm that common sense counsels closing wealth disparities through programs like UNC's, which beyond diversifying the medical profession open doors to every sort of opportunity, helps addresses the aforementioned health disparities in the long run as well. Do not miss the point that ensuring a diverse student body in higher education helps everyone, not just those who, due to their race, have directly inherited the distinct disadvantages with respect to their health, wealth, and well-being. Mimica explained that the students of every race will come to have a great appreciation and understanding of civic virtue, democratic values, and other countries' commitment to equality. The larger economic benefits, too, when it comes down to the brass tacks of dollars and cents, ensuring diversity will, if permitted to work, help save hundreds of billions of dollars annually by conservative estimates. Thus, we should be celebrating the fact that UNC, once a stronghold of Jim Crow, has now come to understand this. The flagship educational institution of a former Confederate state has embraced the constitutional obligation to afford genuine equal protection to applicants and, by extension, to the broader polity that its students will serve after graduation. Surely, that is progress for a university that once engaged in the kind of patently offensive race-dominated admission process that the majority decries. With its holistic review, UNC now treats race as merely one aspect of an applicant's life, when race played a totalizing, all-encompassing, and singularly determinative role for applicants. Like James, for most of his country's history, no matter what else was true about him, being Black meant that he had no shot at getting in the ultimate race-linked uneven playing field. Holistic programs like UNC's reflect the reality that Black students have only relatively recently been permitted to get into admissions games at all. Such programs also reflect universities' clear-eyed optimism that one day race will no longer matter. So much upside, universal benefits ensured from holistic admissions programs that allow consideration of all factors to material to merit, including race. and that merely facilitate diverse students populations. Once trained, those UNC students who have thrived in the university's diverse learning environment are well equipped to make lasting contributions in a variety of realms and with a variety of colleagues, which in turn will steadily decrease the solace of race and future generations. Fortunately, UNC and other institutions of higher learning are already on this beneficial path. In fact, all that have needed to continue moving this country forward toward full achievement of our nation's foundation promises for this court to get out of the way and let them do their job to our great detriment. The majority cannot bring itself to do so. The overreaching reason the majority gives for becoming an impediment to racial progress is that its own conception of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause leaves it no other option. Has a wholly self-referential, two-dimensional flatness. The majority of concurring opinions rehearses the court's idealistic vision of racial equality from Brown forward, with appropriate lament from past discretions. But the race-linked gaps that the law laid, aided by the court, previously found it and forced it, which indisputably define our past, our present reality, are stringently absent and do not seem to matter. With let them eat cake obvious listening today, the majority pulls the ripcord and announces color blindness for all by legal fiat. But deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life. And having so detached itself from the country's actual past and present experiences, the court has now been lured into interfering with the crucial work that UNC and other institutions of higher learning are doing to solve America's real-world problems. No one benefits from ignorance. Although formal race-linked legal barriers are gone, race still matters to the lived experiences of all Americans in innumerable ways. And today's ruling makes things worse, not better. The best that can be said of the majority's perspective is that it proceeds ostrich-like from the hope that preventing consideration of race will end racism. But if that is its motivation, the majority proceeds in vain. If the colleges of this country are required to ignore a thing that matters, it will not just go away. It will take longer for racism to leave us, and ultimately, ignoring race just makes the matter worse. The only way out of this morass for all of us is to stare at racial disparity unblinkably and then do what evidence and experts tell us is required to level the playing field and march forward together, collectively striving to achieve true equality for all Americans. It is no small irony that the judgment the majority hands down today will forestall the end of the race-based disparities. In this country, making the colorblind world the majority wastefully touts much more difficult accomplishments. As the Civil Rights War neared its conclusion, General William T. Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton convened a meeting of black leaders in Savannah, Georgia. During the meeting, someone asked Garrison Frazier, the group's spokesperson, what freedom meant to him. He answered, placing us where we could reap the fruit of our own labor and take care of ourselves, to have land and to turn it and till it by our own labor. Today's gaps exist between that freedom was denied far longer than it was ever afforded. Therefore, as Justice Sotomayor correctly and amply explains, UNC's holistic review program pursues a righteous end legitimate because it is defined by the Constitution itself. The end is the maintenance of freedom. Jones versus Alfred H. Meyer Company, quoting 39th Congressional First Session 111 and 1866. Viewed from this perspective, beleaguered admissions programs such as UNC's are not pursuing a patently unfair ends justified idea of a multiracial democracy at all. Instead, they are engaged in an earnest effort to secure a more functional one. The admissions rubrics they have constructed now recognizes that an individual's merit, his ability to succeed in an institute of higher learning and ultimately contribute something to their society cannot be fully determined without understanding that individual in full. There are no special favorites here. UNC has thus built a review process that more accurately assesses merit than most of the admissions programs that have existed since this country's founding. Moreover, in so doing, universities like UNC create pathways to upward mobility for long excluded and historically disempowered racial groups. Our nation's history more than justifies the course of action, and our present reality indisputably establishes such programs are still needed for the general public good, because after centuries of state-sanctioned and enacted race discrimination, the aforementioned intergenerational race-based gaps in health, wealth, and well-being stubbornly persist. Rather than leaving well enough alone today, the majority is having none of it, turning back the clock to a time before the legal arguments and evidence establishes the soundness of UNC's holistic admissions approach existed. The court indulged those who either do not know our nation's history or long to repeat it. Simply put, the race-blinded admissions stance the court mandates from this day forward is unmoved or critically real-life circumstances. Thus, the court's meddling not only arrests the noble generation projects of America's universities are attempting, it also launches, in effect, a dismally misformed psychological experiment. Time will reveal the results, yet court's own missteps are now both eternally memorialized and excruciatingly plain. For one thing, based apparently on nothing more than Justice Powell's initials say so, it drastically discounts the primary reason for the racially diversity objectives it exercises are needed. Co-signing race-related historical happenings to the court now analytically disturbing. Also, by latching into the arbitrary timelines and professing insecurity about missing metrics, the court sidesteps unrefuted proof of the compelling benefits of holistic admission programs that factors in hard to do, for there is plenty. Simply proceeding as if no such evidence exists, then ultimately the court surges to vindicate equality. But Don Juan style pitifully perceiving itself as the sole vanguard of legal high ground, when in reality its perspective is not constitutionally compelled and will hamper the best judgments of our world-class educational institutions about who they need to bring into their campuses right now to benefit every American, no matter their race. The court has come to rest on the bottom line conclusion that racial diversity is higher education is only worth potentially preserving insofar as it might be needed to prepare Black Americans and other underrepresented minorities for success in the bunkers, not the boardroom, a particularly awkward place to land in light of the history the majority opts to ignore. It would be deeply unfortunate if the Equal Protection Clause actually demanded this perverse, historical, and counterproductive outcome. To impose this result in that clause's name when it requires no such thing, and to thereby obstruct our collective progress toward the full realization of the court's promises is truly a tragedy for us all. This is Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson dissenting opinion from Thursday's Supreme Court ruling against affirmative action. It has been lightly edited to remove some footnotes and legal citations. There we have it. Affirmative action will no longer be considered in college admissions. For those who would not particularly get an opportunity here, a dissenting opinion, this is one. So we went over 20 minutes. It was 55 minutes in reading. So I hope that we can come together, we can learn, we can educate ourselves on what is taking place in America. And the more we know, the more educated we are, the more involved we become, we can affect change in a very positive way. This is Elder Stacey Sanders. Like always, to the next video. God bless you.